So I want to get your thoughts, obviously, on the Irish performance. Niamh, what's the most concerning aspect over the last two games based on what you're seeing?
There's a couple of things. I think we've conceded very soft tries from individual errors, particularly on the edges, which is a little bit concerning. And then our attack, it's very lateral, it's very flat. I know that you've had Brian Driscoll and Keith Wood and Liam Down, and they've all spoke about it. But for me, it's really disappointing to see so many good players that we finally have, in that back line and not being able to use them. It's I'd say it's very frustrating for them.
That's the most damning thing in some ways. Like, I saw Sam Warburton picked his Lions team thus far in the championship and had Henshaw and Ringrose in the team. So we have Henshaw and we have Ringrose there. We have James Lowe, who's all action for Leinster. We have Keith Earls, who, when he's not having to chase box kicks all day, is still a bloody good player. We have Hugo Keenan. We saw his hands against Munster at Thomond Park, and they are reduced as a cohort to looking like they don't have much going on, Niamh.
Yeah, look, I think, that still that did the rounds on social media during the week on, the stolen line out, and they look up and it's almost like a fear of failure, a fear of making a mistake. I'm not sure, what that atmosphere or what the repercussion of trying to have a go brings to them in the review the following day. But I think that was probably the most concerning thing. I think if you look at their attack, when they get into phase play, it's almost like they come really late around the corner. So their hips are at the touchline, but there's nobody there to straighten the line. So you're kind of just depending on Gary Ringrose to try and tuck the ball under his arm and have a step back inside. But, if I'm defending Ireland, I'd be delighted I'd actually nearly be giving them the ball and let them make mistakes and live off that, as opposed to feeling fear when they have it, because they don't exploit it. And I felt at times, they looked to get the ball to the edge but never moved forward. So basically, Billy Burns passes to Robbie Henshaw. He doesn't move any steps forward. He passes to Ringrose, doesn't move any steps forward. So as a defence, it's really easy just to shepherd across and use the touchline as an extra defender. And at the first game, I thought that Ireland were chasing their tail a bit because they were down a player and that they were late coming around the corner all the time. But it must be a ploy that they're an attacking, way. It must be a way if they want to attack that they're going to, come late. But it makes very little sense to me, because you're either depending on Gary Ringrose or your winger to get the ball in very little space and try and create some magic. I can't see the sense of it, really, to be honest. For me, with players like, Hugo Keenan, Gary Ringrose, James Lowe, Keith Earls, Jordan Larmour, if you get, if they're early set up and they're straight, well, then they can step inside or outside, whereas at the moment they don't have that option.
Eddie O'Sullivan did a piece, Niamh, on Against the Head, where he showed numerous other examples to go with the stolen line-out example you've mentioned, where Ireland had an overlap and chose not to use it. And like serious overlaps as well, often like 2-3 extra men, and yet took it back into contact, and he couldn't really figure it out either. And when you talk there about late round the corner and hips facing the touchline, you think of Johnny Sexton at his best, and he very much has hips facing the opposition, and he'll pull that pass late. He really fix the defenders in front of him. And now, that picture you paint of hips facing towards the touchline and Ireland crabbing across the pitch almost laterally. I mean, the intellectual knowledge is there. I mean, they've seen Sexton and other proponents at their best and not doing that. So why have we drifted into this is the burning question at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a question for the management. I think they have these incredibly good players at their disposal. It's not as if we're trying to make do with players that aren't good enough at this level. That backline is more than capable. I thought it was very interesting that they selected Billy Burns to start at 10 and yet, kicked all the time, whereas their tactic was to kick all the time, then put the more natural kicker at the start. Ross Burns is a way more natural kicker than Billy Burns. Billy Burns is good at running 10. He's good at seeing space late. He's good at, off the cuff stuff. So was it a case of they tried to back him, but then played at a game plan that didn't suit him? So
I think that's what it was. I think they felt a pressure to back Billy Burns because of what happened at the end of the game in Cardiff and chose the wrong 10 for the game plan they had, which was so obviously to kick. But I think it was a show of faith in Burns.
That's fine then, but then don't put him in the situation where he's in now, because, you know, he's come off the pitch, and while you said he's not done anything really, really wrong, he hasn't done anything brilliant either. And now, you know, he's not really on anybody's tip of the tongue. You know, everybody's talking about, well, Ross Burns, you know, nailed his colours to the mast. Well, of course he did. He was playing with his whole backline that he plays his club with. So even if things weren't going awry, you know, for them, or things were going right for them, he had an ability to be able to use the strengths of others around him that they knew about. But for me, you know, they had moments, especially in that big last phase, where they got a half a break and they looked like they could eke up, you know, another few metres on the pitch, and all of a sudden we're 10 or 15 metres back. And that's a big concern for Ross Byrne as well. And I'm, you know, while he played very well and he kicked incredibly well, they're the moments that you've got to judge at this level, and it wasn't good enough for me.
And one last one before I bring Rory in. You used the phrase there a few times, late around the corner, late coming around the corner. What does that mean? What's the issue with that? Why is that happening? Explain what that means if I'm watching the game on TV.
Yeah, it just means that as you come, you're kind of almost a couple of seconds behind the ruck, so that you're arriving around with your hips facing the touchline as opposed to your hips straightened. Now, there's no issue if you catch the ball towards the touchline but straighten in your first step. Then you fix what the defender is in front of you, and then you open space for other people around you. Or if you're drifting in around the corner, but there's people outside you that are straight. So like Hugo Keenan, you know, like Keith Earls, like James Lowe. I remember being coached by Greg McWilliams very early on in my career, and he used to say to me, you know, stand in and around the 15 because you're coming onto the ball straight, and then allows you then to be able to step in or out, but also gives you options. Whereas if you're coming around the corner and you're not straight, you're just drifting with the ball as opposed to putting something on it, and therefore it's really difficult. Then you're eating space up outside you, and it's really hard to generate pace off that.
Yeah. Rory, what's really notable about all of that is these are things that Niamh says she heard very early on in her career. They are fundamental basics to attacking play.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all very concerning, really, isn't it? I mean, these are excellent rugby players who've been the best player on their team the whole way up in you know, at all levels, who have been able to do all of the things that they're being asked to do all the way up, and suddenly they get to the Six Nations and they're not executing at all. And I do think this coaching ticket has made an effort to try and remove some of the structure around the way they're playing, but the players don't seem to be adapting to that particularly well, and look like they're a little bit lost with that responsibility, which is definitely a worry. The attacking strategy looks a bit muddled to me. I don't understand why we're kicking, you know, Gary Owens off first phase, clean line-up. But, you know, why would you go off the top and then kick Gary Owen? I mean, that's something that we haven't seen for 30, 40 years as an attacking tactic. I accept the forecast was pretty bad. But, you know, even still, you should trust your skills and use that golden attacking opportunity to try and test the defence in a much better way. And maybe they saw a weakness in France's back three, but whatever they saw didn't materialise, because Brice Dulin was absolutely superb. But they kept doing it throughout the game, despite the fact that France had coped pretty well. And fair enough, if you're a kicking team, they're a kicking team, but France were a better kicking team on Sunday. All of France's kicks were more effective than Ireland's kicks. Selection is a big issue, because I think the squad selection at the start has left them a little bit of a hostage to fortune. I mean, he ended up starting Gibson Park, who is I think is a perfect sub, but is not a great starter, and is very much a running tempo number 9. And he was trying to play a game control role at 9, whereas Luke McGrath's better at that. John Cooney's better at that. John Cooney's in the stand as the 24th man, having only been added to the squad the day before the game. Luke McGrath's not even in the squad, and then you've got Craig Casey on the bench, who's definitely one for the future and possibly could do a job right now. But here you are in the last 20 minutes against France, and you've got a rookie on the bench and you don't trust him, obviously, when you've got Kieran Marmion, who's done it before, beating the All Blacks in England, Luke McGrath and Cooney, you know, sitting at home. You know, you start with a 10 who's not the best goal kicker at his own club, who looked very low on confidence. You know, a few things he did well, but I thought he was cagey in what he did in that early one that Niamh spoke about when he had the overlap and he kicked it away. That was indicative to me of a player who was just trying to feel his way into the game when Ireland actually needed someone in that position, which is the problem position at the moment, to grab the game by the scruff of the neck. All of that being said, they were a whisker away from being 10-0 up, or certainly 8-0 up after, 25 minutes with France were in the bin, and started quite well and lost their way again. So even with all of those issues that we've kind of pointed out, their game management has been poor as well within games, and they've kind of had this consistent problem in the third quarter of games where they've lost their way, and Andy Farrell's talked about it but hasn't been able to fix it. So there's a myriad of issues there. The attacking game is clearly the most obvious thing that we can all see. There's a lot of heart and a lot of fight and a lot of determination, and the players are clearly playing for the coach, and I think they like the environment and all of that sort of thing. But at this level, you need a whole lot more than that, and we're not seeing that at the moment.
Yeah, sorry. Just I think for me as well is there doesn't seem to be any clear kind of pathway in terms of what they're looking for. So when Joe Schmidt arrived into Ireland first, you know, at Leinster, he was going to make them the best passing team, and Leinster were unbelievable at passing. And when he started with Ireland, it was, you know, something that he continued on. Ireland were brilliant at passing. Yet we aren't, you know, our execution, our accuracy, you know, every ball doesn't really, we can't run onto, because for me, that accuracy, that execution isn't where it needs to be. To like that James Lowe try, you know, should have been a try, but if you look at the passes in the lead up to that, you know, they weren't great. So everybody's kind of reaching. And at this level, if you're taking a half a step to reach back or to the left or to the right or whatever it is, then your space is gone. The moment is gone. You've got to be way more technically astute than that, and they don't have that.
Yeah, Keith Wood mentioned that the other night. He said there's a lack of confidence and crispness in the passing, and so your point is each of those not so great passes costs the next player a fraction of a second, and they add up by the time you get out to James Lowe. Yeah,
for sure. I think there was a big mantra, you know, when Ireland were doing so well over, you know, 2016, 2017, 2018, about, you know, you've got to have your job so right that the next person looks brilliant. And that's what they lived off, that mantra. That was their ethos, and it really served them well. Okay, I know things took a different route after that, you know, 2018 brilliant season, but they've got to go back to that. They've got to find some middle ground where their skill level has to be better in the coalface. Yeah. That's a non-negotiable for me, I think, in terms of their attack and what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the point of skill and not making mistakes, because, Rory, I think we have just become a team that make what you would call uncharacteristic mistakes, but now if we keep making them 2 years on, they just sort of become characteristic. Like, they've become a team that unfortunately makes silly errors, and the initial reaction as viewers to go, oh, well, look, that's not like that player and he's a better player than that. But for some reason, that's almost infected the team a little bit. And Niamh talks about ethos as well. And it was very interesting listening to Andy Dunn on Off the Ball on Sunday after the game. And he was talking, as Andy often does, about just bigger picture for a second, away from the specifics of this game. He was asking questions about, for instance, just the lack of offloading. And again, it feels like we've been talking about that for a couple of years now. And he cited the example of, do you remember when Gibson Park and Lowe had that exchange on the left-hand side of the pitch? You know, a bit of spontaneity broke out and you saw a little flash of the Lowe we see at Leinster. And Andy made the point that nobody around them was alive to the moment and went with them. You know, they were practically on their own. It was almost as if the rest of the team kind of stunned at this moment of unplanned offloading and back and forth that sort of happened. And Andy made the point that on numerous occasions across the game, Irish players, when Ireland have the ball, will have their back to the ball, and they'll be more worried about jogging back to get into their next pod for 3 phases down the line, as opposed to being alive to the moment a bit more. Now, we can't become the babas, you know, and nobody's advocating that, and structure is important. But like, we still haven't really hit the heads-up rugby in so much as people like Andy or Brian O'Driscoll or you guys can see, that you really would have hoped a year and a bit into the Farrell Mike Catt regime that we would have. You know, it's still fairly prescribed, and we're bottom of the offload charts and we're bottom of the line break charts, and you just kind of wonder what's going to change.
Yeah, there's been no shortage of possession. They've had more passes and more runs than anyone else in the tournament, and they've scored 2 tries. They're throwing 1 offload in every 54 possessions that they have, which is just an outrageous, like an outrageously conservative number. That's incredible. They're doing 1 in 54, and I think the problem is that they're not prescribed in what they do in some ways, because they don't really have that kind of prescriptive Joe Schmidt plan to get through to have that level of incision off first phase or second phase in the way that Joe built those plays.
Yeah,
they're being trusted to do it themselves, and yet they're playing conservatively when they're doing it, if you know what I mean. So I think they're being told to play heads up rugby, but when they get out there, whether it's confidence or a lack of confidence in whatever structure they've been given, they're not executing what they're doing well enough or accurately enough to do it. You know, we've seen ringrows make little half breaks, we've seen Earls make little half breaks, but there's no one on their shoulder, there's no one ready for the offload, or else the person is so focused on winning the ball back at ruck time, which is probably something that's come from the previous era, or maybe that's what Paul O'Connell's focus is on, that their heads are down and they're ready to hit the ruck rather than accept the pass. And even that bit of magic from Gibson Park and Lowe, like Gibson Park gets rushed into touch. Ultimately, it handed possession back to France. So it's muddled. There's little glimpses of things here and there, but it's far from enough. And it's, these players are better than what we're seeing. I think ultimately it comes back to are the coaching ticket and are the players are they matching the potential of what they have there on paper?
Yeah.
And I think in probably 12 out of maybe 13 out of 15 positions, you've got really, really, really good top quality international players. And those players are good enough to do better than what we're seeing at the moment. I don't know, is it they're being left down by, inexperience and lack of confidence at 10, which is obviously the link between the forwards and the backs. Maybe the tactics need to go more around their 9. Maybe the 9 needs to run the play more. As Andy has spoken about previously when in that interview maybe a couple of weeks ago, which was really, really interesting to listen to. But if your 10 isn't as good as Johnny Sexton, which, let's face it, it's not going to be for the next little while, if at all, there's no guarantee that there's a Johnny Sexton coming, then you need to rethink how you're doing things. You can't just keep playing the Johnny Sexton game hoping that Billy Burns, Ross Byrne or someone else can carry it out, because Johnny Sexton's 35 and he's got a lot of injuries. He's not playing as well as he used to. So it sounds like they're going to bring him back for Italy, but it just feels like you're kicking the can down the road there, and you're kind of sleepwalking through this World Cup cycle, making all the same mistakes you made before, except for you don't have the Joe Schmidt master plan to get you through and get success along the way.